February of 2022 found me 6 months into what my divorce lawyer called the healing chapter, and what I called exile. 34 felt ancient when you were starting completely over, selling the house in Portland, taking a remote position with a software company, and moving into a farmhouse rental in rural Vermont that cost less per month than my old car payment. The property sat on 11 acres of nothing but birch trees and silence. The nearest neighbor, a dairy farmer named Gus Whitmore, who lived about 2 miles down Hadley Road. I had wanted isolation. I had wanted to hear myself think again after 3 years of arguments and accusations and slamming doors. My golden retriever, Penny, was the only company I needed, or so I told myself during those long winter nights when the wind screamed through the valley and the old radiators clanked like someone was trapped inside them. I had grown used to the sounds of that house, the way the floorboards groaned when the temperature dropped, the way ice would crack and pop against the windows like knuckles tapping glass. I thought I understood that place. I thought I knew every noise it could make. Wednesday started like any other day that week. Gray sky, coffee that never got hot enough, and a work call at 9 where my camera stayed off because I had not brushed my hair in 2 days. The weather report mentioned a storm rolling in from Canada. Nothing unusual for February in that part of the country, so I made sure I had enough firewood stacked on the porch and checked that the generator had fuel. By noon, the snow had started falling in thick curtains that erased the tree line within an hour. I remember standing at the kitchen window with Penny pressed against my leg, watching the world outside turn white and formless, feeling that particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you cannot go anywhere and no one can reach you. Around 3 in the afternoon, the power went out with a soft click, and the house settled into that heavy silence that always follows when the electrical hum disappears. I lit candles, started a fire in the wood stove, and felt almost grateful for the excuse to unplug completely. Then my phone buzzed with an emergency alert, and that fragile sense of peace shattered like ice under a boot heel. The message was brief and clinical in that way government warnings always are. An inmate had escaped during a transport accident on Route 12, approximately 9 miles from my location. The man's name was Carl Eugene Vickers, 41 years old, serving 18 years for aggravated assault and armed robbery. He was considered dangerous, possibly armed, last seen heading northwest into the Green Mountain National Forest, which meant he was heading directly toward the stretch of wilderness that bordered my property. Residents were advised to lock all doors and windows, report any suspicious activity, and avoid going outside until further notice. I read the alert 3 times, standing in my dim kitchen with the wood stove crackling behind me and the snow piling against the windows. 9 miles was not that far. In good weather, someone determined could cover that distance in a few hours. But in a whiteout blizzard with temperatures dropping below 0, surely no one could survive long enough to make it this far. That is what I told myself as I double-checked the deadbolt on the front door and wedged a chair under the handle of the back door that led to the mudroom. Surely the cold would stop him before anything else could. I tried to keep busy as the afternoon bled into evening. I fed Penny, heated soup on the wood stove, and read by candlelight while the storm howled outside like something wounded and furious. Every few minutes I would check my phone for updates, but the signal was weak and getting weaker, the screen showing one flickering bar that disappeared entirely by 6. The isolation that had felt like freedom that morning now pressed against me from all sides, heavy and suffocating. I found myself listening to the house in a way I never had before, cataloging each creak and groan, trying to separate the familiar sounds from anything that might be new. The wind threw snow against the north-facing windows in waves, and sometimes I could swear I heard footsteps on the porch beneath that noise, a rhythmic crunching that would start and start again. But when I pulled back the curtain and held a candle to the glass, I saw nothing but white. Just the storm, I told myself. Just branches falling, just the old house settling in the cold. Penny lay by the wood stove with her head on her paws, watching me pace with those calm brown eyes, and I remember thinking that if she was not worried, then I should not be either. That changed around 9. I had just added another log to the fire and was settling into the armchair with a blanket when Penny lifted her head suddenly, ears pricked forward, body going rigid in that way dogs do when they hear something humans cannot. She stared at the floor. Not at the door or the windows, but at the floor, specifically at the old heating vent near the baseboard where the previous owners had installed some kind of grated cover. A low growl started in her throat, so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining it, then building into something I had never heard from her before. Penny was the gentlest dog I had ever owned, the kind who greeted strangers with a wagging tail, and had never shown aggression toward anything except the vacuum cleaner. But now she was growling at that vent with her lips pulled back from her teeth, hackles raised along her spine like a ridge of dark fur. I sat frozen in the chair, watching her, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. She would not look away from that vent. And then, beneath the sound of the wind and the crackling fire, I heard it too. A scraping noise, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere below the house. The farmhouse had a basement that I never used. The previous tenant had warned me about it when I signed the lease, said the stairs were rotted and the space was prone to flooding in the spring. I had gone down there exactly once in those first weeks after moving in, and found nothing but crumbling stone walls, a dirt floor, and the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam whole. There were two ways in, an interior door in the hallway that I kept padlocked from my side, and a set of exterior cellar doors on the east side of the house that opened outward from ground level. Those cellar doors had a heavy iron latch on the inside, plus a security grate that the landlord had installed years ago after a break-in at another property he owned. I had checked that grate when I moved in, tugged on it to make sure it was solid, and then mostly forgotten it existed. But now, sitting in my candlelit living room with my dog growling at the floor, I thought about that basement with a clarity that bordered on panic. I thought about how the exterior doors were buried under snow. I thought about how the interior door was only 15 feet down the hallway from where I sat. And I thought about the sound I had just heard. That scraping, like something being dragged across stone. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Penny would growl again, and I would snap back to full alertness, straining to hear whatever she was hearing. The sounds from the basement came and went in irregular intervals, sometimes silence for 20 or 30 minutes, then a sudden thump or scrape that made both of us jump. Around midnight, I heard something new, a metallic clinking, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone tapping a wrench against iron bars. I knew exactly what that sound was. It was the security grate. Someone was down there, testing the grate, trying to find a weakness in the metal. I grabbed my phone and tried to dial 911, but the screen just showed no service in that cruel little font, and I wanted to scream at it, wanted to throw it against the wall. The landline was dead too. The storm must have taken down the lines along with the power. I was completely cut off, alone in this house with my dog and a locked door and whatever was making those sounds 15 feet away. I thought about running, just grabbing Penny and bolting out the front door into the blizzard. But the snow was piled 3 feet high against the porch and the temperature had dropped to -15. I would freeze to death before I made it halfway to Gus Whitmore's farm. So I waited. I sat in that armchair with a kitchen knife across my lap and a cast iron skillet within arm's reach, watching the hallway, watching Penny, listening to the sounds from below. The clinking continued for what felt like hours, sometimes fast and frantic, sometimes slow and methodical. I tried to picture what was happening down there. A man in the dark, hands numb from cold, working at the bolts that held the grate in place, desperate to get inside where it was warm. The image was so vivid I could almost see him, could almost smell the sweat and fear and frozen desperation. Every few minutes, Penny would look at me with those worried eyes, and I would whisper to her that it was okay, that we were safe, that the grate would hold. But I did not believe it. The sounds kept coming, metal on metal, and around 3 in the morning I heard a new noise, a groan of protest like something giving way under pressure. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The groaning stopped. Then silence. Then nothing but the wind and the fire and my own ragged breathing for the rest of the night. Dawn came slow and gray, the storm finally dying down to scattered flurries that drifted past the windows like ash. I had not moved from the armchair in 8 hours, and my body ached in places I did not know could ache. My neck, my shoulders, the small of my back where tension had coiled like a fist. Penny had fallen asleep sometime around 5, curled into a tight ball at my feet, but I could not bring myself to close my eyes. When the first real light crept through the curtains, I forced myself to stand, joints popping, legs unsteady beneath me. I needed to see. I needed to know if what I had heard all night was real or if I had somehow imagined it, if the isolation and fear had finally cracked something loose in my mind. I pulled on my boots and my heaviest coat, grabbed the kitchen knife and stepped out onto the back porch for the first time since the storm began. The world outside was white and silent and impossibly still. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like you are the last person left alive. And then I looked down at the snow beside the house, and I knew I had not imagined anything. Footprints. Deep, heavy footprints in the fresh snow, circling the entire perimeter of the house. They started at the tree line about 50 yards out and approached in a wandering path. Like whoever made them was searching for something, testing doors and windows before moving on. I followed the trail with my eyes, my breath coming out in ragged clouds, watching it loop around the front porch, past the kitchen window where I had stood watching the storm, around the north side where the old propane tank sat buried in a drift. The prints circled the house 3 times before they finally stopped, right at the exterior cellar doors on the east side. I walked over to that spot, moving slowly, the knife clutched in my frozen fingers. The cellar doors were almost completely buried under snow, but someone had dug them out. I could see the disturbed snow, the gouges in the ice where hands had clawed at the frozen ground. The doors themselves were still closed, the iron latch still in place from what I could see. But the footprints did not lead away. They stopped at those doors and simply ended, as if whoever made them had melted into the earth or been swallowed by the basement below. I ran. I did not think, did not plan, just grabbed Penny and my car keys and plowed through the snow to my Subaru, which sat buried up to its wheel wells in the driveway. It took me 15 minutes of frantic digging with my bare hands to clear enough snow to get the door open, another 10 to rock the car free from the drift that held it. My fingers were numb and bleeding by the time I finally got the engine started, but I did not care. I drove straight to Gus Whitmore's farm, fishtailing down Hadley Road at speeds that should have put me in a ditch, and pounded on his door until he answered in his bathrobe with a shotgun in his hands. I must have looked insane, wild-eyed, shaking, blood on my hands from the ice cuts, words tumbling out of me so fast I could barely understand them myself. But Gus just listened, nodded once, and called the county sheriff on his landline while his wife Eleanor wrapped me in a blanket and pressed a mug of hot coffee into my frozen hands. The deputies arrived within the hour, 2 young men who looked barely old enough to shave, and I led them back to my property to show them what I had found. They searched the woods behind my house for 3 hours. I watched from the kitchen window, Penny pressed against my side as they trudged through the snow with their flashlights and their radios, calling out to each other in voices I could not quite hear. They found more footprints in the tree line, signs of a makeshift shelter someone had built from fallen branches about a 1/4 mile into the forest. They found a torn piece of orange fabric caught on a bramble, the same orange as a prison jumpsuit, but they never checked under the house. I told them about the sounds, about the security grate, about the footprints that ended at the cellar doors and never came back out. They nodded politely and said they would look into it, but I saw the way they glanced at each other, saw the look that passed between them. Just a scared woman living alone, that look said. Probably imagined half of it. They left around noon with promises to patrol the area, and I stood in my driveway watching their cruiser disappear down Hadley Road, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I did not stay in that house another night. I packed a bag, loaded Penny into the car, and drove to a motel in Burlington where I stayed for the next week, jumping at every sound, sleeping with the lights on. I called my landlord and told him I was breaking my lease, told him he could keep the deposit, told him I did not care about the money. He argued at first, threatened legal action, but when I explained what had happened, the storm, the fugitive, the sounds in the basement, his voice changed. He went quiet for a long moment, then said he would send someone to check the property. 3 days later, he called me back. His voice was different now, strained and hollow, like a man who had seen something he could not explain. They had found the security grate bent outward from the inside, 2 of the bolts sheared clean off. They had found scratches on the interior basement door, deep gouges in the old wood where someone had tried to claw their way through. And in the far corner of the basement, beneath a pile of old tarps and rotted insulation, they had found a makeshift nest, empty food cans, a filthy blanket, and a sharpened piece of metal that looked like it had been fashioned from part of the grate itself. Someone had been living down there. For how long, no one could say. Carl Eugene Vickers was captured 6 days after the storm, nearly 40 miles north of my property, suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia. The news said he had been hiding in an abandoned hunting cabin, that he claimed he had been there the whole time since his escape. Maybe that was true. Maybe there was someone else in those woods that night. Some other desperate person who found my basement and spent hours trying to break through to where I sat, waiting with my knife. I tell myself that sometimes, when I wake up at 3 in the morning and cannot fall back asleep, I tell myself it was not him, that it was just some homeless person seeking shelter, that I was never really in danger. But I remember the way Penny growled at that vent. I remember the sound of metal scraping against metal in the darkness below my feet. And I remember those footprints in the snow, the ones that circled my house 3 times before stopping at the cellar doors and never coming back out. I live in an apartment now, 3rd floor, no basement, no attic, no crawl space. Penny still sleeps at the foot of my bed, and sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring at the heating vent near the baseboard. When she does that, I do not sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a sound that I pray will never come again. My wife Naomi and I had hiked Crescent Peak maybe 30 times since we moved to Colorado. We knew that trail, the way you know the hallway to your bathroom at night. Every root, every boulder, every switchback where the pines opened up to show the valley below. We had done it in spring when the wildflowers exploded across the meadows, in fall when the aspens turned the mountain into a wall of gold, and yes, in winter, when the snow transformed everything into this silent cathedral of white and gray. By 2024, after 6 years of marriage and countless weekends on that mountain, we considered ourselves experienced enough to handle a February hike. The forecast showed clear skies until evening, temperatures hovering around 20 degrees, wind minimal. We packed our usual winter gear, hand warmers, extra layers, emergency blankets, granola bars, and left our car at the familiar trailhead parking lot around 9 in the morning, expecting to reach the summit by noon and be back down before 3. For the first 2 hours, everything went exactly as planned. Naomi walked ahead of me like she always did, her red jacket a bright beacon against the snow, her breath puffing out in little clouds that caught the morning light. We talked about normal things, her sister's pregnancy, the leak in our basement that we kept putting off fixing, whether we should finally get a dog now that we had the yard for it. The trail was packed down from other hikers, easy to follow, and we passed a few people coming down who nodded and mentioned the views from the top were spectacular today. I remember feeling this deep contentment, this sense that life was exactly as it should be. Naomi turned around at one point and smiled at me, her cheeks pink from the cold, and I thought about how lucky I was that she actually enjoyed these hikes instead of just tolerating them for my sake. We stopped at our usual spot, a flat rock overlooking a frozen creek, to drink some water and share a protein bar. That was around 11:15, and the sky was still perfectly blue, not a single cloud in sight. The weather changed so fast that I still have trouble believing it actually happened that way. One moment we were walking through sunshine, the next the temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer door, and this gray wall came rolling over the ridge above us. I have seen storms move in quickly before, but nothing like this. Within maybe 10 minutes, the sky went from clear to completely overcast, and the first flurries started falling. Light at first, almost pretty, the kind of snow you see in Christmas movies. Naomi laughed and stuck out her tongue to catch a flake, and I pulled out my phone to check if there was any updated weather alert. No signal, which was normal for that elevation, but the radar from that morning had shown nothing coming our way until after midnight. We decided to skip the summit and head back down, figuring we could outpace whatever was coming. That decision probably saved my life, though it almost cost me Naomi. By the time we reached the switchback where the trail curves around a massive granite outcrop, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet. The snow was no longer light and pretty. It was coming down sideways, driven by a wind that seemed to cut right through every layer I was wearing. I could barely keep my eyes open against it, and the trail ahead had disappeared under a fresh blanket of white. Naomi was still in front of me, but her red jacket had faded to a dim blur, and I had to shout for her to hear me over the wind. We stopped to put on our goggles and zip everything up tight, standing close together with our backs to the gust. I remember her face when she looked at me, not scared exactly, but serious in a way I rarely saw from her. She grabbed my hand and said we needed to stay close, no more than arm's length apart, and I nodded because I knew she was right. We started walking again, slower now, trying to follow what we thought was the trail. That was our first mistake. In a whiteout, what you think is the trail is just your brain trying to make sense of nothing. I do not know exactly when we got separated. That is the part that haunts me the most, that I cannot pinpoint the moment I lost her. We were holding hands, and then at some point we were not, and I assumed she had just moved slightly ahead like she always did. I kept walking, head down against the wind, following what I thought were her footprints in the snow. But fresh snow fills footprints in seconds during a storm like that, and I was probably following nothing, just depressions in the surface, shadows, my own desperate hope. I called her name, but the wind swallowed the sound before it could travel more than a few feet. I stopped and turned in a full circle, shouting Naomi over and over, and all I saw was white in every direction. No red jacket, no movement, no response. Just this endless, swirling, suffocating white that seemed to press in from all sides. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers. Still no signal, battery at 62%, and the cold was draining it fast. I had maybe a few hours before it died completely. The rational part of my brain told me to stay put. Every survival guide, every article I had ever read about getting lost in the wilderness said the same thing. Do not move. Stay where you are. Let rescuers find you. But Naomi was out there somewhere, possibly walking in the wrong direction, possibly hurt, and the thought of just standing still while she disappeared into that storm was unbearable. I made a decision that I will second guess for the rest of my life. I decided to retrace my steps and find her. The problem was, I had no idea which direction my steps had come from. Everything looked identical. I picked a direction that felt right, that seemed to slope downward the way the trail should, and I started walking. Every few seconds I would stop and shout her name, listening for any response, hearing nothing but wind. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, maybe 30, and slowly I began to realize that the terrain around me did not match anything I remembered from the trail. The trees were different, thicker, older, with branches that hung low and heavy with snow. There were no trail markers, no boot prints, no sign that any human had ever walked through here before. And then I stumbled into the clearing, and everything got worse. At first I thought I had found a road, some kind of access path that might lead me back to civilization. The ground was flat and wide, cutting through the forest in a straight line, and I felt a surge of hope so intense that I almost cried. But as I walked further, I realized it was not a road at all. It was a logging track, one of those routes they carve through the forest to drag out felled trees. and it was surrounded by destruction. Stumps poked out of the snow like rotten teeth, some fresh cut with pale wood showing, others old and gray and split by weather. Heavy machinery had churned the ground into frozen ruts and ridges that the snow only partially concealed, creating a landscape that looked almost lunar in its desolation. The tracks went off in multiple directions, branching and crossing in ways that made no sense to me. I had never seen this area on any map, never heard anyone mention logging operations on this side of the mountain. I was somewhere I was not supposed to be, somewhere that did not match the terrain I had memorized over 6 years of hiking. I tried to orient myself using what little I could see. The storm had let up slightly, not stopping but thinning enough that I could make out shapes maybe 100 feet away instead of 50. The problem was that nothing I saw gave me any useful information. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks hidden by clouds, and they all looked the same, just white slopes vanishing into gray sky. I pulled out my phone again, desperate for even one bar of signal, but there was nothing. The battery had dropped to 41%. I thought about Naomi, about how she must be looking for me too, probably making the same mistakes I was making, wandering further and further from where we had separated. If she went back to the car and called for help, they would search the trail, the route we always took. They would not think to look over here, in this unmarked section of forest that probably did not even have a name. And even if they did search here eventually, it would not be until tomorrow at the earliest, and tonight the temperature was supposed to drop to 15 below zero. I knew the math. I knew what that meant. Hypothermia would set in within hours of sunset if I could not find shelter or find my way back. I made myself stop and think, really think, instead of just reacting. Panic was the enemy now, not just the cold. I remembered something my father told me once when I was a kid, and we got turned around during a hunting trip in Wyoming. Water flows downhill, and people build things near water. If I could find a stream or creek, I could follow it down the mountain, and eventually it would lead me somewhere. The logging operation had to have an access road, a way for trucks to get in and out, and that road would connect to a real highway eventually. I closed my eyes and listened past the wind, trying to hear anything that sounded like moving water. Nothing. The world was silent except for the hiss of snow and the creak of frozen branches. I picked the logging track that seemed to head most consistently downhill and started walking, counting my steps to keep my mind focused on something other than the growing numbness in my toes. 100 steps, 200, 300. The track curved and split, and I chose the left fork because it kept going down. 400, 500. My feet were starting to feel clumsy, like they belonged to someone else, and I had to concentrate on each step to make sure I was actually lifting them high enough to clear the snow. The light was fading by the time I found the creek. I almost missed it. Just a dark line cutting through the white, barely visible under a layer of ice and snow. But the sound of water trickling somewhere beneath the surface made me stop and look closer. It was flowing, which meant it was heading somewhere, and somewhere was better than nowhere. I turned to follow it downstream, staying close to the bank but not too close, because I knew the snow could be hiding spots where the ice was thin. The temperature was dropping fast now. I could feel it in the air, this sharp edge that had not been there an hour ago, and my breath was coming out in thick clouds that froze on my beard and the edges of my hood. I checked my phone one more time, 23%, still no signal, and I took a picture of the creek and the direction I was heading, thinking that if someone found my body, at least they would know which way I had gone. That was when it really hit me. The possibility that I might actually die out here. Not as an abstract concept, but as a real and immediate thing that could happen in the next few hours. I thought about Naomi, about whether she had made it back to the car, about whether she was warm and safe and calling for help, or whether she was out here too. Somewhere in this frozen maze, as lost and scared as I was. I followed that creek for what must have been 2 miles, though it felt like 20. The banks were uneven and thick with undergrowth buried under snow, so I had to climb over fallen logs and push through branches that grabbed at my jacket like hands trying to hold me back. The cold had moved past my feet now and was creeping up my legs, this dull ache that made every step harder than the last. I kept talking to myself, out loud, just to make sure I still could, reciting song lyrics, listing the names of everyone at my office, describing what I was going to eat when I got home. Anything to keep my brain working, to fight off the fog that I knew was the first sign of serious hypothermia. The creek widened as I went, joined by smaller tributaries, and I took that as a good sign. Bigger water meant I was getting closer to the bottom of the mountain, closer to somewhere that people might actually be. And then, just as the last gray light was starting to fade into darkness, I saw something that made me want to collapse right there in the snow. A fence. A wooden fence, old and weathered, running along the far side of the creek. Fences meant property. Property meant people. People meant survival. I crossed the creek at a narrow spot where rocks broke the surface, soaking my boots in the icy water but not caring, because nothing mattered except getting to that fence. On the other side, I found a path. Not a trail, but an actual path, worn down by feet and maybe vehicles leading away from the creek through a stand of bare aspens. I followed it with the last energy I had, my legs moving on pure stubbornness, my hands so numb I could not feel them anymore. The path curved around a hill, and then I saw lights. Yellow lights, warm and glowing, coming from a small cabin maybe 300 yards ahead. I tried to run, but my body would not cooperate, so I shuffled as fast as I could, waving my arms even though no one was outside to see me. When I reached the porch, I pounded on the door with fists I could not feel, and when an old man opened it with a shotgun in his hands and suspicion on his face, I could barely get the words out. "Lost," I said. "Wife's still out there. Please help." He looked at me for a long moment, then lowered the gun and pulled me inside, and the heat from his wood stove hit me like a wall. He wrapped me in blankets and handed me a cup of something hot. I do not even remember what it was. And he picked up a landline phone and called search and rescue, while I sat there shaking so hard I could barely hold the cup. The next few hours were a blur of voices and radio static and headlights cutting through darkness. The old man, his name was Howard, I learned later, had lived on that mountain for 40 years and knew every inch of it, including the logging tracks I had stumbled through. He told the rescue team exactly where I had come from based on my description, and they recalculated their search grid to include that area. I wanted to go with them, wanted to be out there looking for Naomi, but my core temperature was dangerously low and they would not let me leave the cabin. A paramedic stayed with me, monitoring my vitals, slowly warming me up with heated blankets and warm fluids. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. I kept thinking about the cold outside, about how the temperature had probably dropped below zero by now, about how Naomi was smaller than me and would lose heat faster. I prayed to a God I was not sure I believed in, making promises I knew I would keep if he just let her be okay. Around 9:30, the radio crackled with a transmission that made everyone in the room go quiet. They had found someone. Female. Red jacket. Conscious but hypothermic. They were bringing her down. Naomi had done everything right. When she realized we had gotten separated, she had stopped moving immediately and found shelter. A shallow depression beneath a rock overhang, barely big enough for her body, but enough to block the wind. She had wrapped herself in the emergency blanket from her pack, the one with the reflective silver coating, and she had stayed there for almost 5 hours, conserving energy, trusting that I would get help and send someone back for her. The rescue team found her because of that silver blanket. One of them caught a flash of reflected light from his headlamp and investigated. She had mild frostbite on 3 of her fingers and moderate hypothermia, but she was alive. They brought her to the cabin where I was waiting, and when I saw her walk through that door, pale, exhausted, her lips still slightly blue, I held her so tight that I thought I might never let go. We did not say anything for a long time. We did not need to. Howard stood in the corner of his kitchen, watching us with this quiet expression, and later he told me that in 40 years on that mountain, he had seen a lot of people get lost, and not all of them came back. "We were lucky," he said. "Stupid, but lucky." I could not argue with either part of that. We still hike, Naomi and I. We went back to Crescent Peak the following summer, stood at the spot where we got separated, and tried to figure out what had gone wrong. The answer was simple and humbling. We had overestimated our experience and underestimated the mountain. The storm that hit us was later classified as a microburst, a localized weather event that formed and dissipated within a few hours, too fast and too small for the regional forecast to catch. It was bad luck, pure and simple, the kind of thing that can happen to anyone no matter how prepared they think they are. But bad luck does not excuse bad decisions, and I made plenty of those once the storm hit. I should have stayed put when I lost Naomi. I should have trusted that she would do the smart thing, which she did, and that moving around blindly would only make everything worse. Instead, I let fear override logic, and I nearly got us both killed. These days we hike with GPS beacons, satellite communicators, and a strict rule that if we ever get separated again, we both stay exactly where we are and wait. We check weather forecasts obsessively, and we tell at least 3 people our exact route before we leave. Howard passed away last year. I saw his obituary in the local paper, and I drove up to his property to pay my respects. The cabin looks smaller in daylight, ordinary, just a wooden structure on the side of a mountain. But to me it will always be the place where I came back from the dead, where a stranger with a shotgun and a landline saved my life and my marriage. I left a bottle of whiskey on his porch with a note that said thank you, though I knew no one was there to read it. Some debts you can never really repay. You just carry them with you and try to be worthy of the second chance you were given. The winter I took that night shift at the little 24-hour convenience store felt like something I agreed to, out of stubbornness more than necessity. At the time, I was juggling community college classes during the day and trying to save enough money to move out of the apartment I shared with my cousin. Night shifts were quiet, predictable, and honestly a break from the chaos of everything else. That particular night, the cold outside didn't feel real until you stepped near the front windows. Ice crusted along the edges, like the glass was slowly shrinking. I remember pacing the aisles around 1 a.m., organizing things that didn't need to be organized, just trying to stay awake while the heater rattled in that uneven way it always did during the deep freezes. Closing hours didn't technically apply to us, but our manager insisted we lock the doors between 2 and 3 a.m. so we could restock safely. I hated that hour. Customers could see the lights on and still come up to the door, and I'd have to mime closed through the glass like an idiot. That night, I had just finished taking out a trash bag when I heard sharp tapping on the front window. Not loud, more like hurried, uneven knocks. A man stood there, wrapped in a thin hoodie so soaked with frost it looked stiff. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face carried this pinched expression, like the cold had peeled away everything except desperation. He mouthed something, then knocked again, faster. I walked up to the door, holding my arms tight across my chest because the cold seeped through the frame. Before I could say anything, he pressed his palm flat against the glass and blurted out, "Please, can you just let me in for a minute, just to warm up? I just need a minute." His voice had that trembling edge that made me instinctively want to help, but rules were rules, and we'd been warned repeatedly not to open the doors under any circumstances. I shook my head gently, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained through the crack in the auxiliary speaker that I couldn't unlock it. His expression shifted, not anger exactly, but this tightening around his jaw, like my refusal had knocked something loose inside him. I stepped back a little, expecting him to leave, but instead his gaze shifted past me, toward something behind my shoulder. When I turned slightly, I noticed another figure outside, a second man standing several feet behind him in the snow. He wore a dark coat and kept both hands in his pockets. No visible tension, no shivering, no attempt to get closer. He just stood there, unmoving, his face shadowed by the store's overhang. The first man looked from him to me, then leaned in again, knocking harder now, each strike echoing through the empty store. I backed away farther, and as soon as I did, the two of them peeled off in opposite directions like they had choreographed it, heading toward the side doors and testing every handle they could find. They moved with this unsettling coordination, never speaking to each other, never calling out, just checking door after door like they already knew the layout. I hurried behind the counter and hit the security lock button, even though I wasn't sure it did anything beyond making me feel less exposed. Through the side window, I saw the first man tugging at the metal handle so aggressively that the whole frame vibrated. The other one walked slower, dragging his boots through the snow in a careful line, almost like he was tracing a path he'd followed before. The store felt smaller with each of their attempts. Every sound echoed. Each rattle of a door, each scrape against the siding. I tried calling our overnight manager, but the call went straight to voicemail, and the silence in my ear after the beep made my throat tighten. I crouched low behind the counter, peeking through the bottom portion of the glass, hoping they'd give up. Instead, I heard the crunch of snow near the back delivery area. One of them had gone around the building, maybe both. I couldn't see anything from that angle, only the faint blue headlights from a car parked at the far end of the lot. Its trunk was wide open, the interior light flickering every few seconds, as if the bulb was dying. I hadn't noticed the car earlier, which was strange because the lot was usually empty at that hour. The open trunk made me nauseous in a way I couldn't rationalize, like I was staring at a problem with an answer I didn't want to know. When I finally stood up enough to look through the front window again, the first man reappeared. This time much closer to the glass than before. His breath fogged the surface in uneven bursts. He wasn't knocking now. He was staring directly into the store, scanning every aisle behind me as if counting the steps it would take to get to each one. Before I could duck again, he tried the door one more time, gripping it so tightly his knuckles went pale. Then he stepped aside without warning, and the second man came into view from the opposite direction. They exchanged a look. Not quite communication, more like they were confirming something silently, and then both walked briskly toward the back of the building again. I grabbed the store phone and called 911, whispering because my voice felt too loud in the empty aisles. The dispatcher kept asking for details, but all I could do was describe the two men circling the building and the open trunk in the lot. While I was on the call, a sharp metallic clang hit the back door, followed by another and another, steady, deliberate strikes. I told the dispatcher about it, and she said an officer was already en route, but the closest one was several minutes away. I remember pressing my hand against the underside of the counter to stop myself from pacing, trying to decide whether to hide in the storage room or stay where the security cameras could see me. Before I made up my mind, the clanging stopped, replaced by a long swiping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ice near the back entrance. The dragging sound moved slowly along the rear wall of the store, pausing every few seconds before continuing, as if they were positioning something or testing angles. I stayed crouched, barely breathing, trying to listen through the hum of the outdated freezer unit behind me. Then, without warning, the security lights on the side of the building flickered on, casting a sharp white glow across the snow. In that brief illumination, I saw both men standing near the corner of the lot, not at the door anymore, but beside their car. The first man paced in a tight circle, rubbing his sleeves like he was warming up for something, while the second stood motionless beside the open trunk. Whatever they were doing, it felt deliberate, like there was a sequence to their actions that I wasn't meant to understand. The harsh lights clicked off again, plunging everything back into that bluish winter darkness. I ducked out of sight, terrified they'd seen me watching. A few seconds later, I heard a new sound, the slow crunch of footsteps approaching the front door once more. But only one set this time. I risked lifting my head just above the counter, and there he was, the first man, leaning close to the glass, his breath spreading across it in frantic patterns. His face looked different now, almost eager, as if he believed something had changed. He cupped his hands around his eyes and scanned the store with this unsettling patience, neither knocking nor speaking. Just waiting. Before I could pull back again, headlights swept across the parking lot, cutting through the frost-coated windows. A patrol car rolled in, tires crunching through the hard-packed ice. At the sight of it, the man at the door whipped his head toward the lot, then sprinted toward the car with the open trunk. The second man slammed the trunk shut with a violent thud, and the two of them jumped inside their vehicle before the officer even had time to step out. Their engine revved hard, fishtailing as they tore out of the lot and disappeared down the road, spraying snow everywhere in their rush to get away. The patrol car tried to follow but lost traction, giving them several seconds of advantage, more than enough for them to vanish into the dark. The officer eventually came inside to check the building, making sure no doors had been tampered with. He walked around with me, shining his flashlight along the back wall and the frozen pavement, but whatever they had dragged or moved left no clear marks, just smeared patches in the snow where the ground looked disturbed. The open trunk, the way they circled the store, their silent coordination, none of it added up. The officer stayed until sunrise, but the men never came back, and their car was never identified from the description I gave. Even now, I still wonder what would have happened if I had unlocked that door. If the story would have ended inside that trunk instead of behind a counter, waiting for help that barely arrived in time. Ice storms in the Pacific Northwest are rare, which is exactly why nobody was prepared when one hit our region in early 2024. My neighborhood in a small town outside Seattle basically shut down overnight. Schools closed, businesses locked up, and by the second day, the power grid had collapsed across 3 counties. At 26, still finishing up my nursing degree while working part-time at a veterinary clinic, I thought I had a decent handle on emergencies. My apartment complex sits at the end of Birchwood Lane, right next to a small cluster of older houses that have been there since the 70s. One of those houses belonged to Howard Freely, an 83-year-old widower who had lived alone since his wife passed 6 years ago. Howard and I had developed a friendly routine over the 2 years since I moved in. I would shovel his walkway in winter. He would leave bags of homegrown tomatoes on my doorstep in summer. He was sharp, funny, and always had a story about his days working as an electrician for the county. When I called his landline that Thursday morning and got no answer, I figured the phone lines were down like everything else. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees and the ice kept coming. I bundled up in 3 layers, grabbed my flashlight and a thermos of hot coffee, and made my way across the frozen yard to Howard's place. The walk that usually took 2 minutes became a 10-minute shuffle across what felt like a skating rink. His house looked dark, obviously, like every other building on the block, but something about the stillness bothered me. No smoke from the chimney, no movement behind the frost-covered windows. I knocked on the front door and waited, my breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, calling out his name. After what felt like forever, I heard shuffling inside. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the door. The deadbolt clicked, and the door opened just a crack, revealing a sliver of Howard's face illuminated by the gray daylight. His eyes, usually warm and crinkled with humor, looked different somehow. Flat, suspicious. He stared at me like he was trying to remember something important, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out thin and uncertain. "Who sent you here?" I laughed at first, thinking he was joking around the way he sometimes did. "Howard, it's me, Nate. From the apartments next door, I brought you some coffee." I held up the thermos like it was proof of my identity. He didn't move, didn't open the door any wider. His one visible eye just kept scanning my face, searching for something. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel the cold biting through my jacket. Finally, he pulled the door open enough for me to step inside, but he didn't say anything welcoming. He just shuffled backward into the dark hallway, keeping his eyes locked on me the whole time. The house was freezing, maybe 50 degrees at most, and I could see my breath even indoors. Howard was wearing a heavy wool coat over what looked like 2 sweaters, and he had a knit cap pulled down almost to his eyebrows. He looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, like the cold had shrunk him somehow. I asked if he was okay, if he had enough food and water, and he just nodded slowly without really answering. The living room was lit by a single kerosene lantern sitting on the coffee table, casting long shadows across the walls. Old photographs lined every surface, Howard with his late wife Meredith, family gatherings from decades past, faded images of people I didn't recognize. I set the thermos down and started explaining that the power company said it could be another 2 or 3 days before they restored electricity to our area. Howard lowered himself into his recliner, the leather creaking beneath him, and watched me with that same unnerving stillness. "You're not from the apartments," he said suddenly, his voice harder now. "I know the boy from the apartments. Young kid, glasses, drives a blue truck." My heart sank a little because he was describing me. I do wear glasses, and my truck is a faded blue Ford I bought used 3 years ago. I reminded him of this gently, told him we had talked just last week about the weather forecast. He shook his head slowly, deliberately, like I was trying to trick him with an obvious lie. "No," he said. "That boy wouldn't come in here pretending to help. You people wait for storms like this. Wait for the lights to go out so nobody sees what you do." I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that Howard was 83 years old, alone, probably dehydrated, and sitting in a freezing house with no power. Confusion in elderly people can spike under stress. I had learned that much in my nursing classes. I kept my voice soft and steady, explaining that I just wanted to make sure he was safe, that I could help him get his fireplace going or bring him back to my apartment where I had a small propane heater running. Howard's jaw tightened, and he gripped the armrests of his recliner like he was bracing for something. "You stay right there," he said, pointing a bony finger at me. "Don't move." He pushed himself up from the chair with effort and disappeared down the hallway toward the back of the house. I stood there in the dim glow of the kerosene lamp, listening to his footsteps creak across the old hardwood floors. Part of me wanted to leave, just walk out the front door and call someone. But who? The roads were impassable. Cell service was barely functioning, and the nearest police station was 12 miles away through solid ice. I heard a drawer slide open somewhere in the back, then the unmistakable metallic click of something heavy being handled. Howard came back into the living room carrying a shotgun. It was an old Remington, the kind with a wooden stock worn smooth from decades of use, and he held it across his chest with both hands like he knew exactly what he was doing. My entire body went rigid. I raised my hands slowly, palms out, and took a small step backward toward the door. "Howard, please," I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "It's Nate. We've known each other for 2 years. You gave me tomatoes last August, remember? The big heirloom ones from your garden." He didn't lower the gun. His eyes were locked on mine, and in the flickering lantern light I could see something terrible swimming behind them. Not anger exactly, but fear. Deep, irrational, consuming fear. "I know what you're here for," he whispered. "Same thing they all want. You think because I'm old, because I'm alone, you can just walk in and take everything. But I've been ready. I've been ready for years." The barrel of the shotgun drifted slightly toward my chest, and I realized with sickening clarity that I could not simply walk out of this house. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up again, ice pellets rattling against the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. The gray light coming through the curtains was already fading, and I knew that in another hour it would be completely dark. I thought about my options, running through them one by one in my head while trying to keep my breathing steady. If I bolted for the door, Howard might shoot. His hands looked steady enough, and at this range he wouldn't miss. If I tried to reason with him, I might just make things worse, feed into whatever delusion had taken hold of his mind. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees, and I noticed my fingers were going numb. Howard gestured with the shotgun toward the couch against the far wall. "Sit down," he ordered. "Sit down and keep your hands where I can see them." I did what he said, lowering myself onto the cold cushions slowly, never taking my eyes off the gun. He remained standing near his recliner, the weapon still trained on me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The kerosene lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across his weathered face, and I tried desperately to find some trace of the Howard I knew. The man who had helped me jumpstart my truck last winter, who had told me stories about building his house with his own hands back in 1978. "Howard," I said carefully, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage, "when did you last eat something? When did you last drink water?" He blinked at me, and for just a second I saw confusion flicker across his features. Not the paranoid suspicion, but genuine uncertainty. "I had coffee this morning," he said, though his voice wavered like he wasn't entirely sure. "Meredith made it before she left for the store." My chest tightened at that. Meredith had been dead for 6 years. I didn't correct him, didn't want to risk triggering something worse, but now I understood what I was dealing with more clearly. Dehydration, hypothermia, isolation. Any one of those could cause cognitive decline in someone his age, but all three together could create a perfect storm of confusion and paranoia. The Howard standing in front of me with a loaded shotgun wasn't evil or dangerous by nature. He was terrified, lost in some fractured version of reality where his dead wife was still alive, and strangers were coming to rob him in the dark. But understanding that didn't make the gun any less real, didn't make my situation any less desperate. I needed to keep him talking, keep him calm, and somehow find a way to either get that weapon away from him or get myself out of this house before something irreversible happened. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of insisting on who I was, I would step into his world, try to meet him where his mind had taken him. "You're right to be careful," I said slowly, keeping my hands visible on my knees. "There are bad people out there, people who take advantage of situations like this." Howard's grip on the shotgun loosened just a fraction, and he tilted his head slightly, listening. "But I'm not one of them. I'm just a neighbor who was worried about you. Meredith would want someone checking in on you, wouldn't she?" At the mention of his wife's name, something shifted in his expression. The hardness around his eyes softened, and for a moment he looked almost lost, like a child trying to remember something important. "Meredith worries too much," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Always telling me to be careful, to lock the doors, to keep the gun loaded." He lowered the barrel slightly, pointing it more toward the floor than at my chest. I felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in my gut. The kerosene lamp sputtered, the flame dancing wildly before settling again, and in that wavering light I saw tears forming in the corners of Howard's eyes. "She hasn't come back yet," he said, his voice cracking. "She went to the store hours ago. The roads must be bad." I swallowed hard, trying to figure out how to navigate this moment without shattering his fragile state. Part of me wanted to tell him the truth, that Meredith was gone, that she had been gone for years, that he was living in a memory that no longer existed. But I knew that could break him completely, could send him spiraling into something even more dangerous. So instead, I nodded gently and said, "The roads are really bad, Howard. She's probably waiting it out somewhere safe. She'll be back when the storm passes." He seemed to accept this, his shoulders dropping slightly as some of the tension left his body. But he didn't put the gun down. He shuffled over to the window, pulling back the frost-covered curtain with one hand while keeping the Remington clutched in the other. Outside, the world had become a solid sheet of white and gray, ice coating every surface, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more to come. "I don't like this," he whispered. "I don't like any of this." Neither did I. My phone was in my pocket, but I had checked it before coming over. 2% battery and no signal. Even if I could call for help, no one was coming through that ice. The next hour passed in a kind of surreal standoff. Howard wouldn't let me leave, but he also wouldn't put the gun down. He sat in his recliner with the Remington across his lap, watching me with that mixture of suspicion and confusion that had become his default expression. I stayed on the couch, my hands visible at all times, talking to him in slow, careful sentences about nothing in particular. The weather, the neighborhood, stories about the veterinary clinic where I worked. Sometimes he would respond, offering fragments of memories that jumped between decades without warning. One minute he was telling me about wiring a house in 1982, the next he was asking if I had seen his daughter lately. I didn't know Howard had a daughter. He had never mentioned her in the 2 years I'd known him. When I asked her name, he went quiet for a long time before whispering, "Lorraine," and something about the way he said it made me think they hadn't spoken in years. The darkness outside had become complete now, the windows nothing but black mirrors reflecting the dim glow of the kerosene lamp. The temperature inside the house had dropped into the low 40s, and I could see my breath with every exhale. I asked Howard if I could light a fire in the fireplace, and he shook his head sharply, saying that the chimney hadn't been cleaned and we would die from the smoke. Around 8 o'clock, Howard's energy seemed to collapse all at once. His eyelids grew heavy, his head began to droop, and the shotgun slipped sideways in his grip. I watched him carefully, barely breathing, waiting for the moment when I might be able to move. His chin touched his chest, and for a few seconds I thought he had fallen asleep completely. I shifted my weight forward on the couch, preparing to stand, to cross the room and gently take the weapon from his hands. But the moment I moved, his eyes snapped open with startling clarity, and the barrel swung back toward me. "Don't," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and lucid. "I know what you're doing. You're waiting for me to let my guard down." My heart hammered against my ribs as I eased back into the cushions, raising my hands again in surrender. "I'm not going anywhere, Howard, I promise." He stared at me for a long moment, that terrible fear swimming in his eyes again. And then his expression crumpled into something that looked almost like grief. "I'm so tired," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so tired of being afraid all the time. I don't even remember what I'm supposed to be afraid of anymore." In that moment, I saw him clearly, not as a threat, but as a man whose mind was betraying him, who was trapped in a prison of confusion and terror that he couldn't escape. I made a decision then, one that could have gotten me killed but felt like the only right thing to do. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and visible, and I walked toward him. Howard raised the shotgun, his finger hovering near the trigger, but I didn't stop. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Stay back." I kept walking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, until I was standing right in front of him, close enough that if he pulled the trigger, there would be nothing left of me. I looked into his eyes, those confused, frightened, exhausted eyes, and I said softly, "Howard, you're cold, you're tired. You haven't eaten in a long time. I'm going to sit down next to you now and we're going to figure this out together. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to take anything. I'm just your neighbor, and I'm worried about you." For a long, terrible moment, he just stared at me, the barrel of the Remington pressed against my stomach. I could feel the cold metal through my jacket. Then something in his face shifted, like a cloud passing away from the sun, and he lowered the gun. It clattered to the floor between us, and Howard began to cry, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. I spent the rest of that night sitting beside him in the freezing dark, feeding him crackers and water I found in his kitchen, wrapping blankets around both of us to conserve warmth. He drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes calling me by my name, sometimes calling me names I didn't recognize, his brother maybe, or an old friend from decades past. By morning, the storm had finally broken. Pale sunlight streamed through the icy windows, and I heard the distant rumble of a plow working its way down the main road. I managed to get a weak signal on my phone and called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, Howard was calm, almost peaceful, though he had no memory of holding me at gunpoint for hours. They took him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with severe dehydration and early-stage hypothermia, both of which had triggered an acute episode of delirium on top of what doctors later confirmed was progressing dementia. His daughter Lorraine flew in from Ohio 3 days later. They had been estranged for over a decade, but the crisis brought her back. Howard moved into an assisted living facility that spring, and I visited him a few times before he passed away the following winter. He never remembered that night, never knew how close he came to killing me, or how close I came to running and leaving him alone in that frozen house. But I remember every second of it, and sometimes, when the power flickers during a storm, I still feel that cold metal pressed against my stomach, Still hear his broken voice asking me who sent me there. Saturday night, December 24th of 2022, and my wife Denise had been planning our little family gathering for weeks. We had moved into our house on Birchwood Lane just 8 months earlier, a modest 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood outside of Richmond, Virginia. My parents drove up from North Carolina, and Denise's sister Maggie came with her husband Owen and their 2 kids. Counting our own daughter Sophie, who had just turned 4, we had 9 people packed into a house that suddenly felt smaller than when we bought it. By 7 in the evening, the kitchen smelled like honey-glazed ham and my mother's famous sweet potato casserole, and Sophie was running circles around the Christmas tree with her cousins, their laughter bouncing off every wall. Having graduated college in 2008 during the recession, it took me 14 years to finally own a home where I could host a holiday dinner, and that night felt like proof that all the struggle had been worth something. The first knock came around 8:30, right when we were clearing the dinner plates and my father-in-law Owen was telling one of his long-winded stories about a fishing trip gone wrong. I remember pausing mid-step, a stack of dishes in my hands, thinking maybe one of the neighbors had stopped by to wish us happy holidays. We had met a few of them during the summer, mostly older couples who kept to themselves but seemed friendly enough. Denise caught my eye from across the dining room and shrugged, and I set the dishes on the counter before heading toward the front door. Our porch light was on, casting a yellow glow through the frosted glass panel beside the door, and I could see shapes standing there, more than one person, their silhouettes dark and still against the winter night. Something about the way they stood there, not moving, not talking among themselves, made me slow my pace before I reached the handle. I opened the door about halfway, keeping my body between the gap and the warmth of the house behind me. There were 4 of them standing on my porch, 3 men and 1 woman, none of them dressed for the weather. One of the men wore a thin denim jacket over a flannel shirt, and the woman had on a hoodie with the sleeves pushed up despite the temperature being in the low 30s. They ranged in age from maybe early 20s to somewhere around 50, and not one of them looked related to the others. The oldest man, a heavy-set guy with a patchy gray beard and deep-set eyes that caught the porch light in a way that made them look almost yellow, stepped forward and smiled at me. He said they were friends of Owen, that Owen had invited them to stop by for dessert, and he apologized for showing up unannounced. I turned my head back toward the dining room and called out to Owen, asking if he was expecting anyone, and Owen appeared in the hallway behind me with a confused look on his face, shaking his head slowly. When I turned back to the group, the story had already changed. The woman, who had stringy blonde hair and a nervous habit of picking at the skin around her fingernails, said they were actually friends of Maggie from her church group. I told her to hold on and went to get Maggie, who came to the door wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she stared at the 4 strangers with absolutely no recognition in her eyes. Maggie said she had never seen any of them before in her life, and that she did not belong to any church group. The youngest of the men, a skinny kid with acne scars and a shaved head, laughed awkwardly and said there must have been some kind of mix-up. Maybe they had the wrong house. But he did not move to leave, and neither did any of the others. They just stood there on my porch, breath fogging in the cold air, watching us with expressions that held something patient and calculating behind the surface politeness. The heavy-set man asked if they could at least come inside to warm up for a minute while they figured out where they were meant to be, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to say no. I told them I was sorry, but we were having a private family dinner, and that I could not let strangers into my home. The words came out firmer than I expected, and I saw something flicker behind the heavy-set man's eyes, a brief tightening around his mouth that disappeared as quickly as it came. He nodded slowly, almost theatrically, and said he understood completely, no hard feelings. Then he turned to the others and made a small gesture with his hand, just a slight movement of his fingers, and without another word the group stepped off my porch and began walking across the front yard. I watched them through the frosted glass as they reached the sidewalk, expecting them to head toward a car parked on the street, but instead they split up. The woman and the young guy with the shaved head went left, disappearing around the corner of my neighbor's fence, while the heavyset man and the fourth member of the group, a wiry man in his 40s who had not spoken a single word the entire time, went right and vanished into the shadows between the streetlights. I closed the door and locked it, then stood there for a moment trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Owen asked what that was all about, and I told him I had no idea. Probably just some confused people who got the wrong address. But even as I said it, I did not believe it. There was something rehearsed about the way they had approached us, something coordinated about the way they had scattered when I refused them entry. Denise appeared at my side and asked if everything was okay, and I forced a smile and told her it was nothing. My father was helping the kids build a tower out of empty wrapping paper tubes in the living room, and my mother was slicing pie in the kitchen, and for a few minutes I let myself get pulled back into the warmth and noise of the holiday. I checked the front door lock twice without really thinking about it, and then I went to help my mother carry dessert plates to the dining room table. That was when I heard the handle of the back door rattle, a slow, deliberate sound that cut through the laughter, like a knife through paper. I set the plates down so hard that one of them cracked against the table, and I moved toward the kitchen without saying a word. The back door had a window in the upper half, covered by a thin curtain that Denise had hung when we moved in, and through the fabric I could see a shape standing just outside. Whoever it was did not knock, did not call out, just stood there working the handle back and forth as if testing whether the lock would hold. I reached the door and yanked the curtain aside, and found myself staring directly into the face of the woman with the stringy blonde hair. She was standing so close to the glass that her breath left a circle of fog on the surface, and when our eyes met, she did not step back or look surprised. She just smiled, a wide, empty smile that showed too many teeth, and then she let go of the handle and took one step backward into the darkness of my yard. I could hear Owen behind me now, asking what was going on, and I heard Denise telling the kids to stay in the living room in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and dialed 911, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. The dispatcher answered and I told her there were people surrounding my house, that they had tried to get in through the front door and were now trying the back, and that I had my entire family inside, including 3 small children. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me units were being dispatched and to stay on the line. Owen had gone to check the windows in the dining room, and he came back saying he could see someone moving along the side of the house, staying close to the wall where the shadows were deepest. My father appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a carving knife from the dinner table, his face pale but his jaw set in a hard line, and he asked me how many of them there were. I told him 4, at least 4, and he nodded once and positioned himself near the back door. The dispatcher was asking me questions I could barely process, and somewhere in the living room I heard Sophie asking her mother why everyone looked so scared. The next few minutes stretched out into something that felt like hours. We gathered everyone into the living room, away from the windows, and Denise sat on the floor with the 3 kids, reading them a story from one of Sophie's new Christmas books, in a voice that barely trembled. My mother sat beside them, her hand resting on my daughter's back, and I could see her lips moving in what I think was a silent prayer. Owen and my father and I took positions where we could watch the doors and the main windows, and Maggie stood near the hallway with her phone out, recording video of the front yard through a gap in the curtains. The dispatcher stayed on the line, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos, telling me the officers were 7 minutes out, then 5, then 3. I kept expecting to hear glass breaking, kept expecting one of those strangers to come crashing through a window, but instead there was only silence from outside, a thick, oppressive silence that was almost worse than noise would have been. They were still out there, I knew they were, circling the house like wolves waiting for a gap in the fence. At 9:14, I saw the flash of red and blue lights painting the walls of my living room, and I have never felt relief like that in my entire life. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, and I watched through the window as 4 officers got out with flashlights already in their hands. I told the dispatcher they had arrived, and she said I could hang up, and I went to the front door and opened it to meet the first officer on the porch. He was a tall man with a shaved head and a calm demeanor, and he asked me to describe what had happened, while his partner began walking the perimeter of the house with his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I told him everything: the knock, the changing stories, the way they had scattered, the woman at the back door, and he listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally and taking notes. His partner came back around the corner of the house and said there was no one in the yard, no one in the back, no sign of forced entry on any of the doors or windows. They checked the side gate, the garage, even looked behind the shed where I kept the lawn equipment, and found nothing but footprints in the frost-covered grass, at least 4 distinct sets leading from the back door toward the fence line and then disappearing into the neighbor's property. The officers took statements from all of us, and Maggie showed them the video she had recorded, though it was too dark to make out much more than shapes moving in the yard. One of the officers, a woman with short gray hair who had been canvassing the street, came back and told us that a neighbor 3 houses down had seen a white van parked at the end of the block earlier that evening, one she did not recognize from the neighborhood. The van had been there when she took her dog out around 7, and it was gone by the time the patrol cars arrived. The officers exchanged a look that I did not like, a look that told me this was not the first time they had heard about something like this. One of them mentioned that there had been a string of home invasions in the county over the past few months, all targeting houses during family gatherings when the occupants would be distracted and the doors might be unlocked. He said we were lucky, that the fact we had not let them in and had called quickly was probably what saved us. He did not say what had happened to the families who had not been so careful, and I did not ask. We filed a police report, and the officers gave us a case number, and they promised to increase patrols in the area for the next few weeks. After they left, nobody felt much like celebrating anymore. My parents decided to stay the night instead of driving back, and Owen and Maggie put their kids to bed in Sophie's room, while the adults sat in the living room with the lights on and the doors double-checked. I do not think any of us slept more than an hour or 2 that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent my heart racing all over again. I kept seeing that woman's face pressed close to the glass, that smile that held nothing behind it but patience and intent. The police never found them, never identified them, never made an arrest. About a month later, I read in the local paper that a family in Henrico County had been robbed at gunpoint on New Year's Day. 4 intruders who had talked their way inside by claiming to be lost and asking to use the phone. I stared at that article for a long time, wondering if it was the same people, wondering what would have happened if I had opened that door just a little wider.